She calmly, respectfully, and with 4 first-class tickets boarded the plane with her husband and 2 children. However, minutes after she had sat down, a flight attendant approached her and ordered her to move to the back of the aircraft. Her children watched in disbelief as their mother got up and left without saying anything, and the entire cabin watched as well, but nobody spoke. What nobody knew, though, was that this woman wasn't just any passenger, she was the wife of the airline's owner. When Darren Elise and his 2 children arrived at the gate, the airport was quiet just before the rush of boarding. Their daughter Paige clutched her small pink travel bag, her eyes wide with excitement, and her little brother Noah was watching with wide eyes. What happened after she was forced out of her seat turned the entire flight upside down. Before we begin the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. If you enjoy stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next one. The family appeared normal, well-dressed, courteous, and quiet, but there was something about the way they moved together that was calm, confident, and peaceful. At the gate, the staff scanned their first-class boarding passes without any problems, and Elise thanked the agent. Darren nodded, holding the boarding slips in one hand. Elise walked beside them, her arm gently resting on Paige's shoulder. Darren answered all of their questions about the plane with a patient smile. Darren took the aisle seat next to Noah and gave him a pair of headphones. First class felt like a treat, and the kids were enjoying every moment of it. There was a shadow, and a flight attendant said, "Excuse me." Once on board, the kids were full of energy, curious about the seat buttons and how far the recliner would go. Paige pressed hers gently, watching the seat glide back with amazement. Elise laughed and helped her settle in. "This is our seats row 2A through D." "Yes," Miss Keller replied in a steady but brisk voice. "There's a manifest issue. It looks like there's a discrepancy and we'll need to rearrange seating to fix the balance in the cabin." Elise furrowed her brow. Her name tag read Ms. Keller. She had her hair pinned back tight and held a small tablet as she looked across the family. Her smile was thin and forced. "There seems to be a seating mix-up." Darren looked up, puzzled but composed. "I understand what Miss Keller said, but her tone didn't match her words." "I'll need you, ma'am, to move to the back so we can seat a confirmed elite passenger here." "Just a quick adjustment," Elise blinked in confusion. "We booked these seats weeks ago, so we're not standby. These are paid first-class tickets." I understand that Miss Keller kept smiling, but her expression has since hardened. "We can't delay the boarding process, so please move to the back." Darren sat up straighter. Quietly, why wasn't there anyone else in this row? Ms. Keller tilted her head, her eyes sharp, saying, "I don't have time for an argument. Either she moves or I'll have to call the ground crew." Passengers began looking over. A businessman 2 rows ahead lowered his newspaper. A couple on the other side turned to watch, but no one said anything yet. Elise gave Darren a quick glance. They exchanged a silent understanding. She turned to Paige and kissed her forehead, saying, "It's okay, sweetheart. I'll just be a few rows back." Burning, but she didn't let it show. Elise grabbed her sleeve and whispered, "Why do you have to go?" Elise forced a smile and said, "Just for a little while." Noah looked at Ms. Keller, his tiny hands clenching the armrests. Darren said nothing, just watched as his wife was quietly led away without offering assistance or even the slightest apology. The row felt colder after she left. Paige slouched deeper in her seat. Noah stopped grinning, reached out, and held their hands. His eyes remained forward, calmly watching, waiting. He hadn't said everything yet, but he would. Elise. When she arrived at her new seat near the back, she put her bag down and sat rigidly between 2 strangers. The space felt claustrophobic and cold. She stared at the back of the seat in front of her, trying not to think about how far away she was from her family. Up in first class, Darren stayed motionless. She walked down the narrow aisle toward the back of the plane with her shoulders straight but her eyes heavy, passing row after row of indifferent faces, some pretending not to notice, others stealing quiet glances. A few rows ahead, Ms. Keller walked with her usual precision, speaking to other passengers in a pleasant tone as if nothing had happened. She offered drinks, fluffed pillows, and hot towels, but as she passed Aaron's row, her voice became more formal. She didn't look him in the eye, and she didn't offer anything to either Paige or Noah. Paige leaned against his shoulder, her voice small. Why did they make Mom move? Noah looked from his sister to his father, perplexed. She didn't do anything. The attendant didn't think the seating was correct and said she needed the seat for someone more important. Noah watched her leave without asking if we wanted juice. Darren's jaw tightened a little as he reached into his jacket and took out his phone. With one hand on Noah's shoulder, he started typing. A moment later, a reply appeared. Which flight? Darren typed back the number. No further explanation was necessary, and the message was read instantly. Back in economy, Elisa's phone buzzed in her bag. She pulled it out, read her husband's message, and took a deep breath. Then, a second message appeared, which was just 2 words, "Don't worry." She put the phone in her lap and briefly closed her eyes. On the other side of the aircraft, Ms. Keller was talking to a trainee flight attendant named Jenna, who had seen the entire exchange earlier but had remained silent. She kept her head down and obeyed orders, but there was still a hint of uneasiness on her face. "Did you check the tickets?" Jenna asked. Carefully, Jenna said, "I saw them," to which Ms. Keller responded, "But things like this happen. People book through points, get upgrades from friends. That doesn't mean they belong up here." She then turned to face Darren's row, where Paige was staring out the window and Noah was holding his father's arm. Something about the whole situation made her stomach turn. Meanwhile, Darren's phone buzzed once more, and he read a new message that said, "Sit tight, I'm handling it." He put his phone away and gently reached for. Captain Reynolds was reviewing weather patterns in the cockpit when a blinking message flashed on the in-flight communication screen. He tapped it open and his face changed slightly as he read the urgent notification marked Executive Alert. "Let's watch something together," he said, smiling softly, and she nodded. Noah leaned in. They had no idea what was going to happen, but Darren and the person on the other end of that message did. He took the phone that was connected to the crew intercom and dialed a direct line to the head flight attendant's panel. Ms. Keller was in the galley pouring sparkling water for a passenger when the call light came on. She wiped her hands, pressed the button, and answered cabin service. "Keller speaking, Ms. Heller." "Looks like we've got someone important in the cabin," the captain said, his voice steady but heavy. "I need you to report to the cockpit now." "Understood," she said quickly before hanging up. As she walked to the front, her steps slowed slightly because of the captain's tone. When she entered the cockpit, both pilots turned their chairs toward her. "Close the door," Captain Reynolds said, and she did. He then pointed to the monitor next to him and said, "You removed a passenger from first class this morning. Can you explain why?" Miss Keller blinked. "Yes, sir." There was a seating conflict. The woman wasn't on the elite upgrade list. She didn't match the profile of the person in seat 2C, which is Darren Whitmore. She didn't answer, so he asked, "Ring any bells?" Her throat tightened. "No, sir." She was seated with her husband and kids, and I assumed she had been put there in error. "You assumed," the captain repeated, "and you didn't confirm with the manifest." I looked over it, but I was trying to avoid hesitation. The subsequent silence made the cabin feel smaller. The co-pilot cleared his throat. "He's not just a top executive, he's the one who signs our paychecks." Ms. Keller's face went completely flat. "You removed his wife from first class, separating their family." The captain texted the board directly. "There was no cross-check or verification, it was a public decision based on your judgment." She tried to speak, but her mouth was dry and her hands were cold. The captain went on, "I've been instructed. Airport security and 2 board representatives will meet you when you land. You must act professionally until then, and in the meantime, you must personally escort Mrs. Whitmore back to first class in public." Miss Keller apologized, her knees feeling weak. "Yes, sir," she managed to say, barely raising her voice above a whisper. "You may return to the cabin," the captain said firmly, adding, "and don't make it worse." Seller exited the cockpit with unsteady steps, and as she pulled the galley door open, her grip tightened. The gentle hum of passengers conversing and the soft clinking of glasses and ice felt like a wave crashing over her, but the energy had changed. Eyes followed her, and now there was a quiet tension in the air. Darren hadn't moved from his seat, but he looked up and met her eyes as she approached. She paused, and this was the part she hadn't prepared for, as Miss Keller walked down the aisle with a stiff smile on her face. She hated the feeling of being seen for the wrong reasons. When she arrived at Elise's row, the woman was sitting upright with earbuds and a calm expression on her face, though her eyes were tired. Elise looked up slowly when Ms. Keller stopped in front of her and removed one earbud. Her hands trembled just enough to make her grip the seatbacks for balance, and every step toward the back felt heavier than the last. "There's been a mistake, and I'd like to guide you back to your original seat," said Ms. Keller, lowering her voice. Elise remained motionless, blinking but keeping her expression unchanged. "A mistake?" "Yes," Ms. Keller nodded. "We went over the manifest once more. We made a mistake." Elise looked at the man on her left and the woman on her right, strangers, who had remained silent when she had first arrived. Then she turned back to Miss Keller. "So now I'm allowed to sit with my family, yes," she said, barely maintaining her composure. Miss Keller's lips parted as though she wanted to reply, but nothing came out. "I had my ticket," Elise continued, "and still you asked me to leave. You didn't hesitate once." Passengers nearby leaned in slightly, pretending to look at their tray tables or magazines, but every ear was tuned in. Elise apologized for the inconvenience, but she didn't get up right away. "You didn't ask anyone else to move," she said in a calm but pointed tone. "But I know what first class looks like and what it feels like to be told I don't belong," Elise said, standing slowly. Ms. Keller's face went pale as she said, "I made a misjudgment, I'm sorry." Elise didn't say anything, she just walked past the passengers who were staring at her, her chin raised not out of pride but because she refused to let her dignity fall behind her. Paige turned first when she saw her mother walking back up the aisle. Her face brightened, Mom Noah smiled and bounced in his seat, and Darren got up to help her eyes. Elise never left Miss Keller, who stood awkwardly a few rows away. She sat down again, this time between her kids, and leaned slightly toward Darren. He squeezed her hand and said, "If there's anything you need during the rest of the flight, please let me know." Elise looked at her, but she didn't say anything. Darren finally said, "You sure there's not another seat in the back?" Elise forced a weak smile, took a step back, and turned away. The cabin was silent for a moment, then quietly. Back in the galley, Miss Keller gripped the edge of the counter so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her breath came quickly and shallowly, despite her best efforts to steady it. She wasn't used to being questioned by passengers or anyone else, and it wasn't like that. When things resumed, tray tables were lowered, seatbelts were adjusted, but the air hadn't returned to normal because the people who had witnessed what had happened now understood what it meant. Jenna, the junior flight attendant, stood nearby quietly refilling the drink cart and watching Miss Keller out of the corner of her eye. After a long silence, she said, "You didn't expect that, did you?" Miss Keller turned sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jenna shrugged, being careful not to sound too bold because I saw how you looked at them as if you already knew. She had worked for the airline for years, handling difficult situations, unruly passengers, and emergencies, but this was different, personal, and it was coming apart quickly. Ms. Keller's jaw tensed as I followed protocol. "No," Jenna said quietly, "you didn't." Her voice was cold rather than angry, and she continued to look away while feigning to check inventory. Her fingers fumbled with the tray labels. "Do you know who he is?" she asked, pausing for a moment before saying, "I do." Her voice fell. "He owns us." Ms. Keller didn't respond. Instead, she stared at the drink cart, pretending she still had control of the situation, but it was slipping from her hands and there was no. Elise leaned her head against the seat in first class, her eyes closed, and Paige held her hand tightly, refusing to let go. Noah was coloring quietly on the tray table, and Darren stared straight ahead, his jaw hard but unreadable. His phone buzzed once, and a message had arrived. Front office saw it, and he didn't reply because he knew exactly what that meant. People had recorded the moment Elise was escorted back to first class, and the passengers had been silent but not blind. Depicted the tension, the words, and the silence that screamed as loudly. One row over, a man in a gray suit leaned forward slightly and said, "Excuse me," to Darren. "I just want to say what happened earlier, it wasn't right." Darren looked at him and then back at his family. "No, it wasn't." The man cleared his throat, and Darren responded, there was a difference, one that couldn't be ignored. At the front of the plane, the intercom buzzed once more, this time not the captain's voice, but the ground crew. Flight 407 confirmed receiving the priority landing notice. The co-pilot acknowledged the message, but Captain Reynolds was already getting ready for what was about to happen. He had flown for decades, witnessed delayed flights, air rage incidents, and security threats, but nothing became more dangerous than an unbridled ego in a position of power. He silently shook his head as he looked out the window at the clouds passing beneath them, knowing that this wasn't going to end in the sky. No one wanted to be caught staring, but no one could look. The atmosphere in the cabin had completely changed. It was no longer just quiet, everyone felt the weight. The silence had become thick, like a pressure settling over the passengers who had watched it all unfold and said nothing. Some sat unusually still, pretending to nap, while others kept looking at Darren and Elise's row, their expressions mixed with guilt, curiosity, and discomfort. Darren sat up straight, occasionally looking at Paige and Noah. Paige rested her head on her mother's shoulder while holding on to her hand. Noah had stopped coloring and was now sitting quietly, staring toward the front of the plane with the serious expression that only a child can have when he knows something unfair has happened but doesn't quite understand why Elise hadn't spoken since she returned. She just sat with her family head held high, but her eyes were tired. Her dignity was preserved, but it had required work. More than any other person on that flight could possibly understand, she looked at Darren's hands resting on his lap. His jaw was set, his fingers were still, and his posture was calculated. His phone buzzed again, sending another message, "A draft of the statement is ready if you want to make it public." He didn't immediately type back, instead looking toward the galley. Ms. Keller hadn't returned yet, and she stood in the back of the plane with her arms crossed tightly, seemingly to protect herself from the cold air that existed. She had sat on the crew bench pretending to organize paperwork, but she hadn't moved in almost 10 minutes. Jenna stood by the beverage station, arms folded, watching her silently. She hadn't spoken since their last conversation, and Ms. Keller felt her presence without even looking. That made it worse. "You ever think about why you did it?" Jenna finally asked, breaking the silence. Miss Keller didn't respond. "You saw a family that didn't wear your uniform." It sounded weak even to her, but Ms. Keller muttered, "You didn't check their names, you didn't check their history with the airline, you didn't even check your own bias." "Look the way you expected," Jenna said in a low but firm voice. "You didn't check their names, you didn't check their history with the airline, you didn't even check your own bias." "That's the problem." Ms. Keller stood abruptly, brushing past Jenna and walking up the aisle. She tried to focus on the small task: straighten a tray here, adjust a headrest there, but the stares followed her. The passengers may have pretended to be courteous earlier, but she could sense that now everyone was watching her every time she moved. She briefly turned her head toward Darren's row and caught his attention. He didn't blink or flinch, just looked at her, and for some reason that was worse than if he had yelled. She quickly turned away and went back to the galley, her heart thumping, her mind racing with 1,000 questions about what would happen when the plane landed. Ms. Keller looked around the galley as if it might be the last time she would ever stand there, because the cabin lights dimmed slightly as the minutes passed and the pilot quietly announced their descent. She knew deep down that it wasn't going to be a suspension, a formal write-up, or even just a warning, but it was going to be bigger, louder, and permanent, because it wasn't just a complaint anymore. It wasn't even just a mistake, it was a decision, a moment that she could never go back. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've started our descent and will be landing soon. Please return to your seats, fasten your seatbelts, and make sure all tray tables are in the upright position. Cabin crew members are getting ready for arrival." The announcement was routine, but nothing about the atmosphere on board felt normal. It was quiet, yes, but not the kind of quiet that comes from calm. Instead, it was tense, heavy, and unstable. After a moment, people realized they should have spoken up, but they didn't. Darren helped Noah fasten his seatbelt once more before reaching across to ensure Paige was safe. Elise held her hand in Paige's and her other hand resting lightly on her lap, tapping slowly and thoughtfully. Darren looked down at his phone and saw 2 new messages. Media is aware that there is footage that is circulating on 2 people's phones. He turned off the screen and put the phone in the seat pocket. His shoulders remained square and his chin level. He hadn't spoken in public yet, and he hadn't called for consequences in front of anyone. He didn't have to power. Real power didn't announce itself. It just moved quietly but permanently. HR's involved. Platform's board had already reviewed it. They'll meet her at the gate. He had looked back multiple times since Ms. Keller confronted Elise, one of the first to act as though he hadn't heard, but each time his bravery had crumbled under the weight of the silence. Now, as the plane dipped lower through the clouds, he looked down at his own hands in shame. Across the aisle, a young woman tapped quickly on her phone, whispering to her seatmate. She had recorded the earlier scene when Elise had returned, complete with the apology, the walk of shame, and the emotion. In the galley, Miss Keller was frozen in place, still holding on to the metal rail. Her reflection in the mirror across from her looked strange, pale, and anxious, stripped of the usual authority she carried like armor. She straightened her collar and then her name tag as if doing so. That hung in the air. She hadn't posted it for attention, but rather because it made her angry, because it felt wrong, and she knew that if people saw it, they might think twice the next time someone was singled out for not fitting the first-class picture. She had hoped that this would remain between the passengers and the flight crew, and that it would be handled quietly like most complaints. However, nothing she fixed now could undo what had been done. Her headset crackled softly, and the captain's voice came through, not to the passengers this time, but only to the crew. Flight 407 final approach, gate team in place, medical and security standing by. Medical insecurity. Ms. Keller's stomach dropped, and her mouth went dry. Retraining sessions, but this was no longer an internal note in her personnel file. It was becoming a headline, and worse, she had given it to them herself. In first class, Elise sat up straighter, her eyes fixed on the window, and the city skyline became visible through the thinning clouds. A quiet storm of thoughts passed behind her composed face. She had been humiliated in front of strangers, treated as though she didn't belong in a place she had paid for, but she managed to keep herself together. Paige turned to her and whispered, "Are we almost there?" Elise smiled softly, almost. Darren fastened his seatbelt and glanced out the window. He didn't say anything to Elise, his kids, or anyone else nearby, but his silence wasn't passive, rather, it was a waiting tactic because the real storm hadn't started yet. The landing was smooth, with the wheels meeting the runway with a gentle bump that marked the end of the flight but not the end of the story. A strange silence descended as the plane rolled gently toward the gate. Darren stayed motionless, one hand resting on his thigh and the other gently holding Noah's shoulder. Elise sat next to him, eyes forward, quiet strength in her posture. Paige had stopped fidgeting, sensing something was different, and she just waited, her small fingers wrapped tightly. The usual hum of activity that followed landing was absent from the cabin. Passengers were reaching for phones, seatbelts were unbuckling prematurely, and flight attendants were preparing announcements. As the terminal approached through the windows, the jet bridge was already in position. 2 uniformed officers were standing close to the glass corridor, and a man in a dark suit with an airline operations badge clipped to his chest had his arms crossed, his face unreadable, and his eyes fixed on the aircraft as it approached the gate. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds completed the last checks, took off his headset, and exhaled through his nose. He looked at the co-pilot who muttered, "They're here," and the co-pilot nodded. I assumed the captain would respond, can't say I'm surprised. Back in the galley, Miss Keller wiped her palms on her skirt for the 3rd time. Her nerves were frayed, and she had tried to keep her composure and control her voice, her expression, and her movements, but it was gone. The quiet dignity that had always come with her senior title, the unspoken confidence she carried down the aisles, had disappeared, and her reflection in the stainless steel panel appeared strange. "You think they'll really?" Miss Keller started, but her voice trailed off. Jenna stood nearby, folding napkins and stacking cups, pretending to be busy, but her eyes kept flicking toward the front of the plane. She hadn't said anything since she got back from the cockpit, but the way she moved and the stiffness in her jaw made her thoughts clear. Jenna didn't look at her, she just said, "They're waiting." The intercom crackled. Miss Keller swallowed hard. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. The local time is 4:10 p.m. Please stay seated with your seatbelts fastened until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of the crew, we thank you for flying with us today." The seatbelt light remained on. The plane stopped at the gate. No one stood. Then the cabin door clicked open. 2 security officers entered, one of whom stayed just inside the threshold, while the other spoke softly to the lead attendant stationed by the gate. When the words clear, calm, direct, Miss Keller were spoken, some passengers gasped quietly, while others remained motionless and leaned forward slightly to avoid being noticed by the crowd. Some even held their phones in their hands, not yet filming, but they were ready. Miss Keller rose slowly, her knees stiff, her face pale, and she straightened her blazer out of habit. Her feet felt heavy as she exited the galley. "I dunno, is there something I started?" But the officer didn't answer. "You'll need to come with us," said the man in the suit. Standing just outside the doorway stepped forward and said, "You're being asked to report directly to the airline board liaison and HR team." "A formal investigation has been opened," she said, looking around. The words didn't fully register at first, but the tone was final. She repeated, "This way, please." The officer gestured again, and she looked toward the cabin, scanning the faces of the passengers she had served or ignored throughout the flight. Her eyes paused for a half-second on Darren, who hadn't moved and hadn't blinked, just watched her like a man who had said all he needed to say, then she turned away. She took one last breath before leaving the plane, her shoes clicking faintly against the bridge floor. The silence behind her lingered like smoke, and inside the cabin, the seatbelt light went out. A new energy filled the room, soft but undeniable. It wasn't celebration or retaliation, just a long-overdue correction. Jenna stood quietly near the galley, watching the doorway close again. After a moment, she walked down the aisle toward Darren and, before disembarking, Elisa knelt just enough to speak softly. "Would your family like anything before you disembark? Water, maybe something for the kids?" Elisa smiled slightly and said, "No thank you, we're fine." Jenna nodded once she stood and turned back, her steps light and steady. A few passengers started to rise behind her, gathering their bags in silence, but no one forgot what they'd seen, and no one would forget who they'd ignored. The aisle buzzed with soft movement as passengers slowly got up from their seats, reaching overhead for their luggage, but the atmosphere was different from most flights. People weren't in a hurry to get out, they weren't laughing or talking, they moved carefully, almost silently, as if the cabin had become a sacred space because of a moment they couldn't pretend didn't happen. Some people glanced at Darren and Elise, then quickly turned away. A few people nodded slightly, as if they wanted to say something, but they weren't sure how to do it. Words were difficult now, and guilt hung over the aisle, unsaid but clearly present. The family stayed seated, and Darren didn't want to get up. When the crowd had dispersed, Elise ran a gentle hand over Paige's hair as she leaned in close to him, and Noah gripped his little backpack with both hands ready but composed. After what they had just gone through, nobody was in a rush. 2 rows ahead, the man in the gray suit turned in his seat halfway through, appearing to be struggling with something inside of him. Words rose and retreated, and at last he leaned slightly toward Darren. "I should have said something," he whispered. Darren looked at him with steady eyes. The man cleared his throat and said, "I just wasn't sure what to do." "You were sure?" Darren said in a low voice, even saying, "You just chose not to." The man nodded slowly, then looked down at his shoes. He didn't look back again when he got up to get his bag. As the line of passengers dwindled and more people moved toward the exit, the whispers became louder. A woman in the back mentioned the. She whispered, "It's got thousands of views already," as someone from the front posted a video on social media with the caption, "Black woman removed from first class, watch how it ends." Another woman nodded, her brows drawn together, and she handled it better than I would have. Elise heard it as they passed, but she didn't turn around. She didn't need approval, and she didn't need strangers to suddenly admire her strength after witnessing her humiliation. Strength wasn't for show, it was survival. When the world was finally ready to listen, Jenna didn't answer, she just held the curtain aside and let them pass. The jet bridge was silent as Jenna continued to assist people exiting with her professional but distant smile. When Darren and his family finally stood to leave, she stepped back respectfully, giving them room. "You handled everything with a lot of grace," she said quietly. "Most people would have raised their voice, but you didn't have to, and it still changed everything." Darren gave her a small nod. The man in the dark suit from earlier, the airline's operations liaison, was waiting near the gate door a few feet ahead of them. His expression was calm, but he quickly straightened his jacket when he saw Darren approaching. "Mr. Whitmore," he said respectfully, "we've already begun the process." When they stepped onto it, there were no crowds or agents blocking the path, just space and air and a sense that something was changing, even if the world wasn't fully aware of it yet. Elise looked toward the large glass windows ahead where more security and staff moved through the terminal. Beyond them, flashing lights of grounded aircraft lit the tarmac in the distance. "Meller is in a private room being debriefed. HR is present. Security will provide their own documentation as well." Darren continued to walk, but his words were clear, "Make sure the documentation doesn't stay buried. It won't." The man responded, "The footage alone ensures that we'll be issuing a public statement this evening." "Now that they're being drafted," the man said, "bias training for all crew, anonymous reporting for in-flight incidents, cross-checking of all removals before takeoff." Darren stopped and turned to face the man, "Make sure it applies to every passenger, not just the ones with power." The man nodded more slowly this time, "Yes, sir." Darren turned and walked into the terminal with his family, Elisa's hand resting gently on Paige's shoulder, Noah taking a step ahead, surveying the area, unaware that he had just been a part of something significant. Despite the fact that their story began on a plane, it wasn't going to end there, it had already taken off. The terminal was bustling with activity, but the family moved through it slowly and steadily as if they weren't just walking, they were processing. The cool air of the airport stung a little sharper after what had happened on the plane, but neither Darren nor Elise showed it. In fact, they were silent as passengers from the same plane passed them, still unsure of what to say if anything. The other passengers trickled into the terminal behind them, but their faces told a different story now. The confidence many of them had boarded with was gone. Some looked around anxiously, while others checked their phones as if expecting the flight's video to have already gone viral. Their children walked between them, Paige quietly holding her mother's hand, and Noah trying to keep up without asking the hundreds of questions that were undoubtedly building inside him. Not even 20 minutes after landing, Elise paused as they arrived at a quiet area of the terminal. Darren stopped next to her, and she adjusted Paige's jacket and bent down to tie Noah's shoelace, her fingers moving slowly. It wasn't about the shoelace, but rather about breathing and grounding herself again after a storm that hadn't begun with yelling but with dismissal. Darren's phone buzzed again, but he ignored it at first. Then, he checked the screen and saw that a new message had arrived from the airline's board chair. A full internal report was ordered, and the press was waiting on a statement. "The legal team wanted input before we went public." He sighed, not out of frustration but because he knew that this was going to be a ripple effect, and whether he liked it or not, his name, his family, their silence, and their suffering were now a part of something greater. Elise got back up. Paige tugged her mother's sleeve gently. "Mom?" "Yes, sweetheart, are we okay now?" Elise looked down at her. "We were always okay." Paige frowned slightly, "But she made you leave, and no one said anything." Elise knelt again, looking her daughter in the eyes. "Sometimes people don't say anything because they're scared, unsure, or just used to things being unfair." He nodded. It was recorded from multiple angles, words, faces, and nothing can be edited out. Going to be in trouble? Darren replied, this time she already is. They started walking once more, this time in the direction of the private lounge area where an airline representative was waiting to take them to their car. The lounge had been prepared beforehand, with no distractions, press, or camera flashes. The board knew better than to allow a mistake like this to become even more visible to onlookers. Inside the lounge, fresh water, coffee, and snacks had been arranged neatly on a table. A staff member greeted them anxiously, not knowing how to welcome A. I'm deeply sorry for what happened today, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore. We've sent an emergency review order to HR and flight operations. Please let us know if there's anything we can do right now. Darren didn't answer right away. He looked at the man calmly but unreadable, saying, I don't need a snack tray or coffee. Finally, I need this to matter. The man nodded flusteredly. It does, sir. Really, this is already moving up. Elisa's voice was quiet but clear, and you all ignored it while it was happening. Every day, somewhere, something similar happens to people who don't have cameras, power, or names on the boardroom walls. What happens to them? The representative wasn't sure what to say, so Darren stepped closer, not threatening, but precise. She thought we didn't belong, but she saw categories instead of customers. He paused, then added, if you're serious about change, then make sure what happened today doesn't become. The man quickly nodded, yes sir, absolutely. Then there was another buzz on Darren's phone, and this time it was an email from his personal assistant. The subject was Keller's formal apology submitted to the board, asking that a letter be sent directly to Mrs. Whitmore. Darren looked at Elise, who already understood what it meant, and she breathed slowly before saying, let her write but let her mean it. The city glowed softly outside the windows of Darren and Elise's home that night. The lights were soft, the house was calm, the kids had gone to bed earlier than usual, Paige curled up with her favorite stuffed rabbit Noah snoring softly under his dinosaur blanket, Elise had tucked them in herself, brushing back their hair, and Darren sent back a single line, we'll read it when it arrives. He put down the phone and turned to face his family. They weren't just a story, they were the proof that silence, when filled with purpose, can echo louder than noise. Downstairs, Darren stood in the study with the glow of his laptop illuminating his face. The screen was full of notifications, emails, news alerts, social media tags, and internal communications from the airline board. The story had taken off the moment they stepped off the plane. She was whispering the same things she always did, you're safe, you're loved, you matter. However, tonight her voice had carried more weight, not because the words were different, but because the world had tried, even for a very brief moment. One of them, taken from just behind Darren's row, went viral. The image showed Elise standing calmly as Miss Keller motioned for her to leave. The sound and the tension were both obvious, and the uploader captioned the photo with, "This is what grace under pressure looks like." The comments were flooding in, and she remained steadfast without raising her voice. Why is this still happening in 2025? The family owned the airline, and they were still profiled. Imagine what happens to people who have nothing. Elise came into the study behind him with her hair tied loosely and a faded college sweatshirt on. She carried a folded letter in her hand, and Darren looked at her before turning to the paper. "It came," he asked, and she nodded. "From her sent directly printed and delivered to our door." Darren had not posted anything and had not made a statement yet, not because he was at a loss for words, but rather because he understood the importance of waiting until the noise subsided enough for his voice to be heard most. "I saw you, your family, your calmness, your silence, and I still told myself a lie. I didn't question your ticket, I questioned your place, and in doing so, I failed. I've worked in the skies for 10 years, managing emergencies, calmed chaos, memorized every procedure, but I never stopped to look at what I carried." I unfolded it slowly. Elise didn't sit, she stood quietly waiting. The handwriting was neat, formal, and the tone was careful, Mrs. Whitmore. "This isn't an apology for the board, it's for you, and I understand if you never want to accept it. However, if you read this, I hope you realize that I've already changed, not because I was caught, but because I saw myself clearly for the first time. I'm sorry, M. Keller Darren. He finished reading and put the letter on the desk. Elise hadn't moved yet, so she wrote it, he said quietly. After a long moment of silence, Elise finally sat next to him. You think I should reply? Darren said, That's up to you, you don't owe her that. No, Elise whispered, but maybe I owe it to myself to answer something that was finally honest. She grabbed a pen and a blank piece of paper and wrote a few lines. M. Keller, you were right. It wasn't the first time you made that judgment, but you're also right about something else. I didn't make fun of you, that was your own mirror. Growth and truth are both uncomfortable, but if you're willing to hold on to both, perhaps this won't happen to the next woman, the next mother, the next voice that chooses grace over shouting you Whitmore. She folded the paper and placed it next to the. This wasn't a story about retaliation, rather, it was about reflection, and sometimes the clearest reflection comes not from glass or water, but from what breaks us. Elise leaned back in her chair as Darren first reached over and placed his hand over hers. They didn't talk, there was no victory lap, no celebration, just a stillness presence. Outside the windows, planes moved through the sky above the city, some arriving, some leaving, some simply circling until they had permission to land, and somewhere in the sky, someone like her was boarding a plane. Was not aware of the story she would be involved in next, but perhaps as a result, tomorrow would be a little more equitable. By the following morning, the story had spread beyond social media posts and comment sections, and major news outlets were reporting on it as a conversation rather than just an incident. Headlines from various platforms repeated the same information: airline executive's family targeted in first-class dispute, bias or blunder, flight attendant fired after separating black family in first class. The story of Flight 407, Gray Silence and Systemic Bias. The video had already been shown on 3 national morning shows and was making the rounds around the world. Public figures, activists, and even experts in the airline industry were weighing in. Some commended Darren and Elise for their restraint, while others criticized the airline for a pattern of gatekeeping professionalism that consistently targets the same type of passenger. Many referred to this as just another instance of how deeply ingrained bias can be, even when policies state otherwise. However, what set this story apart was Darren sat at the head of the long boardroom table at the airline's headquarters that morning, away from the spotlight and cameras, with his team behind closed doors. Senior executives, HR leads, and the brand communications director sat with him, all of them bearing the weight of what the company now had to face publicly. This isn't just about Keller, Darren said plainly, with no anger in his voice, just absolute clarity. This is about what she reflected back to all of us. The uniform didn't make the difference. We have drafted a 3-tier accountability and training revision. First, all in-flight personnel will undergo mandatory Antibius and perception training, updated quarterly, measured anonymously by passengers. Second, we're overhauling our policies. The system that trained her to act without hesitation made a few heads drop. He went on, we've written so many policies, but we haven't changed the posture our staff are trained to control, not to understand. That's what let this happen. The HR director leaned forward, nervous but prepared. The communications director took over on the third. We're introducing a real-time passenger reporting system. Every traveler will be able to rate their in-flight experience before the plane even touches the gate. Any flight interaction will trigger a review regardless of class status or name. Escalation policy: no passenger can be asked to move or relocate without verification from the in-flight system, gate staff, and a digital cross-check. Darren nodded slowly. Silence filled the room. One executive asked, "Are we prepared for the response from the public if this occurs once more?" A few in the room appeared visibly shaken, not by the press coverage, but by the mirror Darren was holding up. They had seen the headlines, yes, but now they were seeing the true cost. "It will happen again," Darren responded. "Bias doesn't disappear with a press release, but when it does happen again, we'll respond like a company that learned, not like one that's just trying to protect itself." Following the meeting, Darren stepped out onto the top floor balcony with the city stretching far below Elise was. She handed him 1 cup of coffee without saying anything, and he accepted it quietly. I watched the entire interview on the morning news, and she said softly, "They used our names, numbers, and only our faces, but that was enough." He nodded and took a sip. "Do you regret how we handled it?" "I regret how long we've carried the expectation to stay silent, to be calm, to make others feel comfortable while we're being erased." Darren took a deep breath of the crisp air. The sky above them was bright and clear now, but they both knew that clouds didn't need to be visible to be present. Later that day, a notice arrived in Elise's email, not from the airline or HR, but from a Midwest school. She said, "But you were still calm." "I didn't stay calm for her." Elise said, "I stayed calm for our kids because I knew they were watching and I wanted them to learn something different from what the world was trying to teach them." After showing her class the news clip, a middle school teacher sent a message with the subject, "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. We watched your story today in my 8th grade social studies class, and my students asked why she didn't yell, argue, or demand that she be heard louder. I told them that she didn't need to yell for everyone to hear her. One of my students said, 'That's what strength looks like when it grows up, so thank you not just for staying calm but for staying seen.'" Mel Howard. Elise gazed at from a moment of dismissal to a classroom full of eyes learning to see differently. In the sky, planes continued to fly, crews continued to board, procedures continued to repeat, but somewhere on those flights someone who had watched that story, who had felt that story, was now thinking twice. She smiled after sending the email for a long time. This was not because it made the injustice disappear or erase the pain of what had happened, but rather because it meant the silence hadn't been wasted. What started as a single flight and a moment of quiet prejudice had become a national conversation, but not the kind that flares up and dies down after 24 hours. This was different. It lingered, it unsettled, it reached places people thought were immune, like private boardrooms, break rooms, classrooms, churches, basements, family group chats, and everyone had something to say because everyone had. Darren had never been used in company statements, but his name had been whispered behind closed doors throughout the industry. His silence had become a storm of its own. He hadn't given interviews or posted anything online, and the video of Elise being quietly escorted to the back of the plane and then brought back with a forced apology had done more than any press conference could. However, the airline was now under close scrutiny, and public trust had been damaged. Requests for speaking engagements, interviews, and opinion pieces. Everyone wanted Darren and Elise to explain the moment, turn it into a headline, and make it a message, but they weren't interested in selling a moment. Instead, they wanted change that would last beyond the moment. Elise stood in the Atlanta Community Center foyer during a roundtable on public service and dignity hosted by a small nonprofit. The room was full of nurses, not politicians or the media. There were murmurs of agreement throughout the room, but what stuck with me was not what they did. A woman in her 50s stood at the front with a microphone in hand. We all watched the video, and most of us weren't surprised because we know what it's like to be treated like we don't belong. We also know what it's like to pay full price and still be treated like a favor. I've never seen strength wrapped in silence like that. Elise stood slowly and accepted the microphone without raising her voice or reading from a paper. "I've sat in a lot of rooms where people expected me to prove I deserved to be there," she started. "That flight wasn't the first time I was asked to move without cause, it was just the first time the world watched it." Elise said, "I've sat in a lot of rooms where people expected me to prove I deserved to be there." Across the room, heads nodded. "I didn't stay quiet because I was weak," she said. "I stayed quiet because I've learned that the real test isn't whether you can raise your voice but whether you can carry your worth in rooms that try to shrink you." There was a heavy silence, followed by applause that was not loud or wild, but long and deep. Later that night, Elise and Darren strolled through the park near their home. The air was cool, and the city lights sparkled on the water by the walking path. They walked for a while without saying anything. "I know," Elise said, "they'll want a platform, a series, maybe a partnership with the airline." "I don't want a campaign," she responded. "I want prevention," and Darren nodded. "They're going to ask again for us to speak for you to speak." Silently but completely, they continued walking past a young couple pushing a stroller, two teenagers skateboarding close to the benches, and a bus driver on his break drinking coffee from a paper cup. These are all regular people going about their daily lives, each with struggles the world never sees. I received another letter from a woman who said in a quiet voice that her daughter now demands to sit next to her on every flight, not out of fear, but because she no longer wants to be silent. Darren glanced at her, and that's how we know we did the. Elise said, I don't want what happened to be remembered as the time we were disrespected. Then what do you want it remembered as? Darren asked. Elise looked out over the water, her voice sure. When people finally noticed who was missing from the table and started pulling up more chairs, Darren smiled. Then we'll keep building the table, they said, standing there for a moment longer. This wasn't because people agreed or because someone got fired. The moment had passed, but the movement had just begun. Schools started updating their staff training on unconscious bias. A regional airline announced a full audit of its in-flight incident reports over the past 5 years. Another competitor introduced anonymous crew evaluations on every flight immediately, not just for premium cabins. And finally, they understood that they were dismissed not because they demanded to be heard but because they refused to be erased. Even with all of this change, Elise remained cautious because she had witnessed too many moments turn into headlines and then disappear without leaving anything behind. She wasn't interested in attention, she was interested in what remained after the spotlight moved on. And yet the letters continued to come. Boardroom conversations started to change, not just the public-facing statements or polished diversity pledges, but the quiet, uncomfortable conversations behind closed doors, the kind of conversations where truth has no polite filter. The home window with a pile of handwritten notes strewn all over the table. Some were from young girls who had seen the video and asked their mothers why the woman had been told to get up from her seat. Others were from elderly passengers who related stories they had kept to themselves for decades, stories in which they were told to move or that they were lost or confused, even though they knew they were right where they were supposed to be. One letter in particular, written in neat little script on yellow-lined paper, read Mrs. I'm 17 years old, and I watched the plane video in my history class. I'm not wealthy, and I've never even been on a plane, but I understood that moment because I've witnessed people like my dad in the wrong neighborhood wearing a hoodie or my mom being treated that way in the grocery store. You didn't scream or break anything, you just sat there as if the seat belonged to you, and that's what made it so powerful. Thank you, Jalen M., Elise read. Upstairs, Darren was wrapping up a video call with the airline's ethics review committee. They had asked him to participate not as a board member but as a witness and representative of the man whose letter she had carefully folded 3 times and placed in a small wooden box she had begun filling with similar notes. She kept them because they were evidence that one moment of calm defiance had grown legs stretched across places they'd never been and planted something in hearts they'd never meet. The loudest signal was silence. Change isn't an event, Darren stated during the call. It's a structure. You don't fix it with apologies, you fix it by making sure the same thing doesn't keep happening to people who can't afford to send a message straight to the board. A woman in her 60s, who had deep lines of wisdom and exhaustion in her face, said softly, I've been working in policy reform for 20 years, but this feels like something we were finally forced to see, and seeing doesn't go backwards. Darren nodded. That's the hope. Later that evening he joined Elise in the living room. The box of letters sat on the coffee table between them. Darren opened one, gently read a few lines, then placed it back. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Finally he spoke. They asked if I wanted to create a public response campaign. Elise raised an eyebrow. You said no. I said not yet. The world outside the windows was muted by dusk, and Paige and Noah had gone to bed early again. They were still young but a little wiser now. Lately, they had been asking more questions about right and wrong, not about cartoons or snacks, but about why adults act unfairly and how to speak up without shouting. Darren and Elise always gave honest answers when we told them what we wished someone had told us. She nodded. We're not done listening yet. He looked at her and grinned. Exactly. They sat in silence, understanding, the television off. Before they went to bed, Darren's phone buzzed. He nearly ignored it, but something urged him to check it. It was a message from a woman named Dana Rowley. There was no title or profile picture, just a brief message that said, I was on that flight, I didn't speak, I should have, I'm sorry if you're building a home. That had become their unspoken mission now, to give their kids the words they were once forced to figure out alone in order to build a home where dignity wasn't something they had to earn but something they never doubted they already owned. Darren and Elise rested that night after the world had stopped talking and the headlines had moved on to the next thing. It wasn't because the work was done, but rather because the silence had finally begun to speak for itself. Weeks went by, and the world, as it often does, shifted its focus to newer stories, different headlines, fresher outrages, louder scandals. He showed it to Elise, and she smiled before whispering, one voice at a time. A school principal changed their discipline policy after rewatching the video of Elise being removed without cause. A chain of restaurants added empathy-based training for staff who interacted with diverse families and guests. A library in Houston launched a promotion, and even though the platform was no longer trending, it had been pushed down by entertainment buzz and breaking news. However, this didn't mean it disappeared because something had been planted. It wasn't a slogan or a campaign, but something much quieter and standard. On flights across the nation, things started to feel different. A mother traveling alone with 2 children was treated with extra patience rather than sympathy. A man wearing worn clothing who had a first-class ticket was not questioned when he took his seat. A black woman with a quiet voice and strong posture received not suspicion but service. These were not drastic changes, they were minor ones. The Right to Belong was a public reading series where community members shared instances in which they had been made to feel invisible and how they reclaimed their space. For Darren and Elise, life didn't slow down, but it deepened. In the airline's internal culture, Flight 407 was recognized not as a scandal but as a point of reference. New flight attendants were trained using excerpts from the transcript, and staff were shown clips of Elise sitting in silence, being asked to move, and being brought back, not because she objected, but because the world finally stopped long enough to realize what it had always ignored. Elise, who had previously kept her public life to herself, now found herself speaking to groups she had never imagined but always on her own terms. She declined television interviews and branding offers because she didn't want her dignity to be sold as content. He also pushed for data transparency, demographics, passenger complaints, patterns, crew decisions, audits, and incident response. He no longer assumed the system was fair. With Darren's help, she established a quiet foundation that provided legal advice and emotional support to passengers who experienced discrimination in mid-flight and lacked a voice loud enough to be heard on the ground. There were no billboards or commercials, just genuine resources hand in hand. One evening, nearly 2 months after that flight, Elise and Darren sat outside in their backyard while the kids were sleeping upstairs and the wind rustled softly through the Somewhere out there another family is boarding a flight. Elise followed his gaze and someone's deciding where they think they belong. Darren turned to her. Do you ever wish we had said something louder that day, done more? She shook her head. The world was loud already, what it needed was stillness. We did enough, she said, leaning back in her chair wrapped in a light sweater. Above them, planes blinked quietly against the night sky, tiny distant moving from place to place without anyone below knowing who sat inside. Darren grinned and said, Truth rises, I like that. It always does, she said, eventually. He reached for her hand, fingers intertwining with hers, warm and steady. A notification buzzed on Darren's phone, but he didn't reach for it. Not this time. They didn't need the next headline. They had done what they came to do. Not for attention, not for retribution. So the next time someone like Elise sat, the stars above flickered, the sky remained steady, and somewhere high above it, another flight passed through quietly, its passengers not realizing that the air around them had been altered by one woman's silence and silence. No one would question whether she belonged in a seat she rightfully owned, and if they did, someone would be watching, someone ready, someone who remembered that story, not just because it was powerful but because it made them ask the right question, not who do you think you are, but why did we ever ask that in the first place? The family that never let go of her seat. If this story resonated with you, please like it and leave a comment. I read all of your comments. Also, remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more inspiring stories.